Okay, so Drew has put us up to talking about how the Bible influences agriculture and vice versa. Potentially vice versa. Well, let's see how it goes.
Agriculture.
Should be an interesting conversation. You might have a lot of thoughts on. We'd love to hear your thoughts via email, on social media. Just let us know. If you see us in person, feel free to chime in. Okay, so Drew has this assignment, and he is to speak on Judaism and agriculture and where those two things intersect. And for me, I think, I'm not really sure where he's going to go with it. It's totally his thing. But he said, let's do a podcast on this. And I think for me, it starts, just to go ahead and get started.
Yeah,
and
please.
I'll pretty
please
much,
do. Please
I'll
do.
probably say this and then you're going to talk the rest of the time.
I doubt it.
But in my opinion, if you don't know our story of faith, is that we were both raised in a religious Christian atmosphere. And when we met each other, we were drawn to each other's spirituality. And Drew already at that time was embracing some of the culturally Jewish things that were found in the scriptures. And, sort of slowly but surely we fell in love with plants and also wanted to incorporate our experience of what the scriptures say in a really tangible and physical way. And there's so many laws and festivals and celebrations to do with agriculture that it feels like that was really what called us to the homestead at all. That's what called us to the life of gardening and what called us to the life of really trying to base our lives around the seasons of nature. But, that also is obviously perfectly aligned with the cycles that are talked about through the scripture and those rules and regulations. And if you've listened to the podcast for a while, we celebrated the Shmita year, which is a year off.
That was back in 2020.
I think it was 2020 to 21, 21 to 22. I don't know. Anyway, it's hard to keep track of because the Jewish year actually starts based on agriculture in the fall. So you're harvesting and that's your new year, right? Like and that correlates. Actually 2 New Years in Judaism. But that's the agricultural New Year. And so that's when that started and ended. So we went from like an October-ish to an October-ish of not tilling, not planting, not growing, not pruning,
not putting away a harvest.
Yeah. So that was a really neat experience. And we tried to do that in alignment with when they're also doing it in the land. And a lot within Judaism, I think that the rule of thumb is generally, this is meant for the promised land. And Drew and I have our own thoughts on that. Maybe he'll get into it. But anyway, so that's just like when I think, how do Judaism and agriculture intersect? I almost don't think that you can remove one from the other. Because the literal calendar is based on the moon and the sun simultaneously.
Well, and I think like the interesting thing about that is like you can't remove one from the other, but like this is a little bit of a spoiler for my talk, but I just we're in a group called Jewish Farmers, which is a worldwide group on Facebook, and guess how many people are in that group?
500?
1,600 worldwide.
Oh, that's more than I thought.
Yeah. But that's tiny compared to like my regenerative grazing group that's like 100,000.
Oh my gosh.
Like to think about it like in that realm of like.
And listen, the group is pretty extensive. The truth is like if you know another Jewish farmer, we pretty much know them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways.
So it's just got me on this like thought of like how within Judaism did we get to that point? And then it just had me like pondering other religions and other like.
Well, there is a whole historical, like the removal of Jews from the land, the removal of the Jewish people from. Yeah, there is like a whole moving them into cities. Yeah, there's like I think we followed that timeline before, and there is a very real.
There's like a physical, like somebody in the group I asked, like, so I was just like curious, like, what do people think? Where did this come from? And, one lady said that she's been taught that, like, when she was a child and asked why are there no Jewish farmers, it's because of kind of like what you said. They, all the way back to the Assyrians, they were growing farms and then they were taken away, and then Babylonian and all these.
It'd be really
times.
frustrating to put all your energies. I mean, even thinking about leaving the property we're on,
right?
Which we've even talked about. Like, there's kind of some development going on around us, and it's like, well, at what point do we leave? It's like, can we ever leave? Like, there's just, you've dug your roots almost in as much as the trees have, and to uproot and move would be very traumatic. And so
then someone comes in and forces,
and then exactly.
And then that happens.
Are you going to do it again? It's like, shoot, no, I'm not starting. Because
I think about like Fiddler on the Roof, like, right. That's like, my favorite Jewish agricultural example. At that point,
I'm just going to sing in the background.
Yeah, no, don't. At that point, there's still an if we're taking that as like full truth value there, still agriculturally based.
Right.
But then, I think a lot of it has to do with like the Holocaust, moving to America. Somebody pointed out, well, there's lots of Jewish farmers in Israel, but there's not outside of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's like a whole...
Well, that was the effort, I think, to start with Israel, in the 40s, was we need to plant this land. It was a concerted effort to turn that into land that was producing.
Turn it into the land that it was promised to be.
Right.
And that's another thought of
with all the kibbutzim and all, all it was a joint effort, and the government was like promoting that and encouraging that in a way that I don't think that happens anywhere outside of Israel within the Jewish community.
Right. And I mean, ultimately the promise is a land flowing with milk and honey.
I will say, I just read the other day that the honey would have been like date honey, not bee honey. I just thought that was interesting. Anyway,
I'm okay with that.
The sidebar.
How do you make date honey? You squeeze dates?
Them. Yeah.
I'm gonna try that. But even that,
you make milk, you squeeze.
Even that promise is based, like the ultimate promise to the people of the book. Kind of all of the religions that follow the Bible is a land flowing with milk and honey, which is like an agricultural promise. It's not like skyscrapers and
of abundance. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know, whatever.
And private jets.
Yeah. Whatever you want to fill in. Yeah. Lamborghinis and a big mansion. Like, it's that you'll have milk and date honey on a land that's yours.
Well, what's interesting, because we have talked about this before, like to leave here, to go anywhere, like if I ever was going to leave here, it'd have to be to somewhere where it was like already growing. It was already ready. Right. Already, like I walked in and I started picking stuff.
Yeah. Well, that's like...
Which is what the promised land was when they left Egypt.
But, and it has me like thinking, okay, so like they were slaves in Egypt. They were Egyptians. Mm-hmm. They were people that were not agricultural. They were like... Egypt was like an urban setting at that.
Mm-hmm. They didn't know what to do. Well, that's why the Bible tells you, I think, because they didn't know what to do.
Forced through the desert.
Well, I just read this quote on the back of Gaia's Garden. The world didn't come with an operating manual, so it's a good thing that some wise people have from time to time written them. And I'm like, well, wait, it does. But at that point, they didn't have one. So their Gaia's Garden was God on the mountain telling Moses, this is how you do it.
Right. Like, eat these animals and don't eat these animals, or...
Plant here and not here.
Yeah.
Build your buildings here and not here.
But what's interesting to me is like and like you said, what attracts me to like every aspect of it is it's like plant barley and in the spring you'll harvest it. But when you harvest it, then it'll be Passover and you'll have a celebration. Mm-hmm. Or plant wheat, and when you harvest it, then you'll have a celebration. Like,
well, even within the context of like the sacrificial system, which, we obviously are not able to do, or, is that even an option? No, but within the context of that, like for there to be a rule that says, every week you sacrifice this lamb and this bird and this grain, means you have all of that. And it's like a promise within this like requirement, which I think I've never really thought of that before. But it's like, if you don't have a lamb, you can't sacrifice it. But if he's asking for something, he's also assuring at the same time you'll have it, which I think is a really...
Well, and there's contingencies. Like if you don't have a lamb, you can bring a bird. If you don't have a bird, bring oil or grain. You know, like it does like kind of dial it back based on your budget, essentially.
Yeah, right. But I mean, still, like the idea, I think, for a slave coming out of Egypt who had nothing,
right?
So then it be said, this, do this. Like it almost is unbelievable, you know. In my, you know, I don't know. Anyway, the context of that I've never really explored.
It is interesting to think about because they do petition that they can take their livestock with them originally when they're getting ready to leave Egypt. So they had.
Well, I think by definition, slavery. I think even in today's world, modern society, we were talking about this with the kids. Is what does slavery mean? And I think we have this really specific vision because, you know, we have in our American history, you know, the African American enslavement period, which was also like a 400-year period. What did that look like? And I think in our minds, we really have that image as what does slavery look like?
Yeah.
But I think the question is, in what way are we slaves now? And compared to that, obviously, it's much, much different in comparison with what was happening in Egypt. And I think, honestly, we're very similar in a lot of ways to what was happening in Egypt because the people didn't necessarily even want to go. There were a lot of people who opted out. A lot of people who died in Egypt because they said, yeah, no, I'm good.
Well, what was it we were reading in the commentary is that the generation in Egypt, the Israelites in Egypt were, like the rabbis say, were the like lowliest of spiritualness. Essentially, like they were hovering around like kind of the worst character for like what there could be at that time. And I just think that that's interesting also is like as they grew and as they came into the desert, their spiritualness grew, but then also the amount of agriculture and things that they started participating in also kept growing with that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because if you start talking about like the mysticism within Judaism, a lot of it has to do with, you know, how even the stars and the moon and some of these things that feel, you know, I don't know what the word is, mystical. I mean, it's really the best word for it. You start taking those into consideration. And when you think about gardening, you know, a lot of folks take into account the moon cycles, and some take in astrology and some take in both. And I think that...
Shout out to Terry.
That's right, Terry. We're listening. We try. And then you've got like this whole biodynamic thing, which is trying, you know, it's even almost a little bit further out, a little bit harder, like taking into all those things into account. And I think Judaism ultimately, and with the moon calendar based on the sun calendar, like I think those two are harmonious and we don't fully grasp them, but the world is always trying to. And within agriculture, especially, because you can see that influence almost really directly. But it can be difficult for us to put it into words in a physical, tangible way, what all that means. And I think that the scripture tries, and when you're in tune with your religious side, you realize there's more that you don't necessarily understand, but that doesn't make it untrue. In gardening and, you know, just your spiritual side and all of that. So I don't know. It's just like this added layer of, okay, well, the Bible does say some about that, and maybe we don't understand the full depth of it, but it is in there. And when you start gardening, you start to realize how there's so much more at play than just a seed in the dirt, and that it's somewhat out of your control, and all you can do is your best to try to experience that and be a participant in all of that.
Yeah, because like I was also thinking about like, you know, it's like excuse me, there's like I don't know if you would call it a commandment, but a verse that says like, when you plant your grapevines, you know, you'll wait to harvest from them. But it doesn't say like if you happen to have a grapevine. It's
Yeah.
like if you plant, or when you plant the grapevine, or like when you plant the wheat, or when you're harvesting the wheat. It's almost like you could flip it to say like it's almost like a commandment,
right,
to have those things. And then like it just kind of got me thinking like, okay, like there's like the physical element to that, but what's the spiritual element to having a grapevine? What's the esoteric, I guess? Or
well, here's like this interesting idea of, okay, you have the slaves leaving Egypt where they didn't get to do those things, right? They maybe had livestock, but they weren't, they didn't know how to plant, harvest, all of those things. And so in order to go into the promised land, I mean, they had manna coming from the heavens, so they were fed. But there's a difference between manna just coming down and you participating in the process of planting this grape and watching what happens. And isn't there like a spiritual element? And then it's almost like the fullness of not being a slave anymore is being a participant in that and those things and having responsibility in that process. And is that also, like I see now when we were talking about Egyptian slavery versus, modern society enslavement, I think there's a very similar correlation there of like people now are so separate from the process of participating in the earth's natural processes, in these very simple but so complex things, and we have drawn ourselves out of it in order to have a simpler life where we're more comfortable. But in doing that, in releasing those things and not participating in those things, are we then not enslaved in a way that we don't have the fullness of life experience in much the same way the Israelites were experiencing at the time of slavery in Egypt? And they were, comfortable in a lot of ways, so comfortable that they didn't cry out. And then finally they did. And when they did, God heard them. It's like, we're like, oh man, how did he leave them for 400 years in slavery? It's like, well, they didn't cry out. And then finally they did.
Right.
And God heard them. So I don't know. It's just really interesting because I've been thinking, and I see people suffering, and not feeling connected, and children especially feeling less and less like they know their place in society, in the world, and looking for that, seeking that in electronics and games and in virtual reality. And is that not enslavement in a
well,
the same
it's
way?
Interesting because you said complicated and complex, and like that's kind of what has happened with our society is we've gone from a complex set of rules and participation in nature where we can't explain everything. There's not like a machine that we can take apart and say, here,
this is the part that goes here.
Nature is so complex that we have no idea. We still they're like every day discovering new ways that nature works and heals and communicates and all that. But we've gone from that to a complicated world or a simple world. Yeah, but complicated in the way of like, machines and, like everything that can kind of be explained is what people or society has tended to go towards.
Even the whole like industrial meat complex thing that's happening right now to synthesize meat. You're trying to break something a living
something
being,
complex and turn it into complicated
and distill it down into 300 different random ingredients. It's just, you can't, we just can't even know what the repercussions of trying to simplify something so complex will be. And I think we are living out, what does it take to, when you extract humans from living in nature, what happens? Well, you get the mess that we're dealing with in the ecosystem right now, right? I don't know. It's there's pretty deep.
So bringing it like all the way back to like scripture, it's like, to me, it's like the whole point of all of those rules and laws is to like maintain that connection with the land, to maintain that connection to the sublime, to the divine. And the more that we say like that rule is for somebody else, or that role can only be done here or there, instead of like, how can we participate in that in a way that maybe makes us uncomfortable, but there's something to be experienced within that.
Well, in the section of the scripture we were reading this week was the final 3 plagues, I guess. And it talked a lot about, in some of the studying that we were doing, there's a lot of talk about how, why did God have to do these terrible things? And if you've ever studied, you know that a lot of the specific plagues had to do with specific things in Egypt that they gods that they had that they thought controlled nature. And they hadn't seen or experienced miracles up until that point. And they hadn't, even the Israelites were not really aware of the power of God. And all of a sudden, they have these very real, tangible experiences where God is saying, I'm going to do this. And then he does it. And he completely controls nature, like every element, in a really direct way, to make it so clear that, I'm not just out here kind of watching what happens. I'm a participant, and I'm making things happen, and I'm in complete control of what everything that's happening in a much different way than you might be able to conjure up some kind of a experience with these other gods of Egypt. And I just think it's really, there was a lot of hope in that, because I think, we tend to think of, we hear a lot of the news, the climate change, it's all falling apart. Oh, there's nothing we can do. And not to say we shouldn't do anything. I absolutely, obviously, hopefully with my life's goals and missions have made it clear. I think we should be doing our very best. But at the same time, at any moment, the creator of this planet and this world can come in and say, essentially wipe it clean, is what sort of happened.
Yeah.
I don't know. There was a lot of hope for me in that, because I think that we tend to think, it's completely on us. And yes, I do think that we should be learning and doing better. But I think that the Bible specifically tells us how to do those things better. And we have eliminated the need for those explanations, or at least the desire. We think we're smarter than that, I think, is what it feels like with modern industry, modern industrial farming. Obviously, it's creating a no man's land,
right?
A place where, and thinking we can do better than God, we're creating a place where we can't live.
Yeah. Well, we've created our own God, which is technology in some ways. And I don't know, it's difficult, because I love technology, and I think there's room for technology. It's just we've replaced God with that, especially with who knows, with the rise of AI, where we're going. I mean, I'll tell you, I love using AI for certain things right now, and I think it's a great tool. But
it's interesting, because I think over the course of time, I thought, oh man, those Amish, they're so extreme. And now I'm like, maybe they had it right.
Maybe the Amish were right.
Maybe the Amish just had the wisdom to resist. I don't know. Maybe not. Who knows?
Yeah, and it's interesting, because another answer within the Jewish farmers group of why Judaism got to where it was because of the lack of ability of community. Was another reason, which I just thought was
a lack of an ability of community. Can you translate? Not really.
Yeah, so Judaism, for people that don't know, really thrives a lot on kind of like a circumference around a synagogue. And for people that don't know, unlike Christianity, or other religions, there's not necessarily one on every corner. It's there's one synagogue in a city, and that's it. So it's
ideally,
hopefully. I mean, some people within some of these farming networks have said, they drive 2 hours to their synagogue.
Well, we get the question a lot, how can I be within walking distance of a synagogue?
Right.
And also on a farm.
Yeah.
And it's not really possible. But when they set up the towns in the Promised Land, the idea was you create the synagogue in the center, and then literally it's concentric circles around that, so that it maintains its ability to be able to walk on a Sabbath day to the synagogue and worship. So yeah, it's interesting how, we're definitely not in that space right now.
No. And I mean, I feel like, even
there were other cultures that built in circles. I remember learning.
Yeah, it was like
in our permaculture
the Mayans would do it
in South America.
Yeah, they would like.
It was a very scriptural way of living, actually, and it was so interesting because they would move it they would build a circle and they would live there, and then in the 7th year they would move the circle over, and then every 4 to 9 years they'd come back to the place where they were, and it,
But within that, it was like wagon wheeled, and they would like burn part of the forest. And they had like various secessions of burning the forest and then the forest turning into like cropland. So they would like go around this circle so that they would have like, by the end of it, they were growing in this cropland. But they kept like,
anyway,
spreading it.
It just makes you wonder like.
But yeah, I mean, I think it had me thinking like another kind of issue with the, I don't know, degradation of connection between agriculture and scripture is the challenge of community, because you can't, like, for a lot of people, I mean, we meet a lot of homesteaders that are lonely across all faiths. You know, they're like, I just want somebody else to be able to talk to, somebody else to work with. And all the time people are like, hey, if we could just share tools and work together and, all of that. It just, to me, it just points out like how much scripture is based on the idea of having community. And I know that's
it's interesting.
Lacey's gonna talk about her dream of a community.
It's almost like one of those things where it's too late now, because
too old
no one would help me, so now I'm like, whatever,
done.
It's too late, I'm too old. No,
I had a bunch of kids and made their own community.
Just for so many years, I've said, let's go in with people. Let's move onto the same property. It doesn't have to be a lot. We can be in the same neighborhood even, and everybody's sort of like, yeah, okay, I'm going to do my own thing. And, I get it. That's the society we live in. And now I think in recent years, people have been much more like, how do we move together? How do we live together? And I'm just past the point of wanting to figure it out.
Well, I was telling somebody the other day, it was, when we found that one property and we were like, oh, we posted on Facebook that we had this property. And then like, it went from like kind of this exciting thing to then you started getting messages from people being like, well, don't let that person, or don't, do you know about this person? Yeah. And it was like, oh man, this is turning ugly really fast. And like, I don't want to be a part of this. And maybe in our younger years, but at this point I was just like, oh, it's going to be like a whole, like, how do people get along? Because, and, within scripture, there's a lot of
within
rules
every community, there's always, everybody doesn't get along all the time.
Yeah.
I'm kind of okay with that. I'm kind of like, yeah, you know what? It is what it is. And I do think that things work out how they're supposed to in the end with the right people and everything. So, that's a whole conversation.
Right. That's a whole nother one.
But I do think that, most of the commandments are meant to be done as a group. It's not like an individual commandment. So within Judaism, I think it's important that, and I think there's just like in every community, I think there's a new movement of people who are excited about returning to that heritage. And I think, again, that's across the board, across all religions. People are trying to get back to like, what was these valuable things that we just set aside for the sake of pursuing, I don't know if it was success or ease or, I'm not really sure.
Do you think some of it is just also though, because our food has gone to where it's gone? Like now people are like, I really don't want to eat that garbage. So like,
oh yeah. Well, I think too, it started because of convenience foods. You're like, oh, I don't have to grow it because I can just get it at the store cheaper than I can grow it.
Right.
So that was like, I think a huge push of people being like, why would I grow this if I can, just people doing the math. Right.
Yeah. And then there was like our generation that like, I remember my mom having like the TV dinners and she's like, isn't this fantastic? You pop it in the microwave and it comes out and we're all like, this is great. It's all like individually sorted out and everything, like, and then like, now we're like, we don't want any of that. We don't have a microwave. We don't it's an interesting, like.
Well, everything, that's new, there's this trial period where you're like, yeah, I'll try it. Why not? That'd be fun. And then you see the impact and the impact isn't good. And so, you know, I think they had to play out. It's like the butter versus margarine thing. You know, I think we watched that play out and now everybody's like, yeah,
That was a bad idea.
maybe we shouldn't have done that. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's all. I mean, I feel like we could talk about this forever, but I'd love to hear.
We have made no conclusions.
Yeah, no conclusions at all.
There's no results from this.
There's
Just a
really
conversation.
no right, no wrong. Let us know your thoughts.
Yeah.
Send us messages on all the different ways.
Share this with somebody who likes to contemplate.
Yeah.
Or somebody who doesn't. Our oldest, Naomi, is going to be really mad about this podcast.
Yeah.
She hates this kind of conversation.
She wants a solid conclusion. And if you know somebody like that, send them this so that they can have not a solid conclusion.
Not a solid yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for listening.